We're continuing with Chapter 12 of A Little History of the World, the Greatest Adventure of All. Alexander has decided, because his troops do not want to continue the conquest of India, to turn back before entering the Ganges Valley, and here we pick up. But they did agree to one thing. They wouldn't go home by the same route. Of course, it would have been the far simpler thing to do, since those regions had already been conquered, but Alexander wanted new sites and new conquests. So they followed the Indus down as far as the sea. There he put his army into ships and sent them home that way. He himself chose to endure new and terrible hardships as he marched home with the rest of the army over pitiless desert wastes. Alexander bore all the privations his army endured, and took no more water and slept no more than the next man. He fought in the foremost ranks. On one occasion he only escaped death by a miracle. That day they were besieging a fortress. Ladders had been set in place to scale the walls. Alexander was first up. He had reached the top when the ladder snapped under the weight of the soldiers behind, leaving him alone at the top of the wall. His men shouted to him to jump back down. Instead, he leapt straight into the city, with his back to the ramparts, defended himself with his shield against overwhelming odds. By the time the others were able to scale the wall and rescue him, he had already been hit by an arrow. It must have been thrilling. In the end, they returned to the Persian capital, but since Alexander had it burnt down when he conquered it, he chose to set up his court in Babylon. This was no idle choice. Son of the sun to the Egyptians, king of kings to the Persians, with troops in India and in Athens, he was determined to show the world that he was its rightful ruler. It may not have been pride that prompted him to do so. As a pupil of Aristotle, he understood human nature and knew that power needs pomp and dignity if it wants to make the right impression. So he introduced all the age-old ceremonies of the Babylonian and Persian courts. Anyone who came into his presence had to fall on their knees before him and speak to him as if he were a god. And in the manner of Oriental kings, he had several wives, among them the daughter of the Persian king Darius, which made him the king's rightful successor. For Alexander didn't wish to be seen as a foreign conqueror. His aim was to combine the wisdom and splendor of the East with the clear thinking and vitality of the Greeks, and so create something entirely new and wonderful. But this idea didn't please the Greeks and Macedonians at all. They were the conquerors, so they should be the masters. What was more, they were free men, and used their freedom. They weren't going to bow down to any man on earth, or as they put it, lick any man's boots. His Greek friends and the soldiers became increasingly rebellious, and he was forced to send them home. Alexander never realized his great ambition of mingling the two peoples. Even though he handed out rich dowries to 10,000 Macedonian and Greek soldiers so that they could marry Persian women and laid on a great wedding feast for all. He had great plans. He wanted to found many more cities like Alexandria. He wanted to build roads and change the face of the world with his military campaigns, whether the Greeks liked it or not. Just imagine in those days to have a regular postal service running from India to Athens, but in the midst of all his plans he died in Nebuchadnezzar's summer palace in 323 BC. He was 32 years old, an age when most people's lives have barely begun. To the question of who should succeed him, he answered in his fever, "He who is most worthy." But there was no one. The generals and princes in his entourage were greedy, dissolute, and dishonest. They fought over the empire until it fell apart. Egypt was then governed by a family of generals, the Ptolemies. The Seleucids ruled over Mesopotamia, and the Adelaides, Asia Minor. India was simply abandoned. But although the empire was in pieces, Alexander's grand project slowly went on taking shape. Greek art and the spirit of Greece had penetrated Persia and passed on through India to China. Meanwhile, the Greeks themselves had learnt that there was more to the world than Athens and Sparta, and more to do than waste their lives in endless squabbling between Dorians and Ionians. And having lost the little political power they once had, the Greeks went on to become the bearers of the greatest intellectual force there has ever been, the force we know as Greek culture. This force was protected and preserved in some very special fortresses. Can you guess what these fortresses were? They were libraries. Alexandria, for instance, had a Greek library that held around 700,000 scrolls. Those 700,000 scrolls were the Greek scholars who set off to conquer the world. And that empire is still standing today. And that is the end of chapter 12.